Alright, so let's go ahead and look at some of the properties that we're going to teach this year in 7th grade. They're not in the 7th grade TEKS, they're from the 6th grade TEKS, but we are assuming that we're going to need to spiral these in for our 7th graders with the TEKS rolling over in both 7th and 6th grade this year. So let's start by looking at the additive inverse property. And you can see if we look at, got my Cool Math browser pulled up here. And so with the Cool Math we can see that all the additive inverse property is taking any number, and they start with the number 5, and any number we can add another value to it in order to get to 0. So here in the first example they use 5 plus negative 5 equals 0, and you can refer students back to you know, what they just learned last week about integers and how they have the same absolute value. And then same here, we have another example where if I start with negative 5, then I can add positive 5 to get to 0. Now this is important for our students when they're solving equations, because let's say I give them a one-step equation like x plus 7 equals 9. Well, they're going to use the additive inverse to undo that plus 7 by subtracting 7 on the left side from the x in order to cancel that out to 0. And so that is the additive inverse property. Our next property is the identity property of addition, and if we look at this one, we can see that our identity property of addition takes any number, and when I add 0 to that number, it equals itself. And so there's the additive identity property. We see that in solving equations. Like, let's take the same example that we used on the last page. X plus 7 equals 9. When I use my additive inverse to subtract 7 from both sides, I know that x equals 2 on my right side, but that x plus 7 and minus 7 cancel out to 0. So I see that x plus 0, which came from my additive inverse, gives me my answer. And so the additive identity just solidifies what we did in that previous step. Okay, our third property is the multiplicative inverse property. And so when we look at this one, we can see that there's a number that I can multiply 8 by to get to 1. And so we know that as the reciprocal 8 times 1/8 equals 1. And so this is our multiplicative inverse. And so the way that our students are going to see that in the classroom is anytime they're solving one-step equations that involve multiplication or division. So let's use 7x equals 56. And so if I have 7x equals 56, my multiplicative inverse would be to take 7 and multiply it by 1/7. Now the way that we usually show that is dividing by 7, and so, but you can see that that multiplicative inverse is there in my division as well. Or if I take x divided by 7 equals 8, then my multiplicative inverse would be, if this is 1/7, multiplying both sides by 7. And so both of those are how the multiplicative inverse sneaks its way into our solving equations. And finally, for our identity property of multiplication, we can go ahead and look at our browser, and we can see that our multiplicative identity shows that any number, when it's multiplied by 1, equals itself. Okay, so there's your multiplicative identity property spelled out. And the way that we're going to see that play itself out as our students are solving equations is after they have something like when we had 7x equals 56, after they use their multiplicative inverse to divide by 7 or multiply by 1/7 on both sides, this 7 divided by 7 simplifies to 1, so that I'm left with 1x equals 8. And so this 1 times x means that this number x times 1 gives me this value, which is what tells me that x equals 8. And so that's how our identity property of multiplication shows up as our students are solving one-step equations.